Hi, everyone, and thanks a lot for joining us. I'm DeMarco Morgan. Our top story this hour, the president is facing mounting pressure Sunday over the disappearance of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. The Washington Post columnist was allegedly murdered by the Saudi Arabian government, according to evidence gathered by U.S. and Turkish intelligence. And a U.S. congressional source has confirmed information first reported in a Turkish newspaper that Khashoggi may have recorded his own death on his Apple Watch. The president has expressed reluctance to punish Saudi Arabia, but on tonight's 60 Minutes, he tells Leslie Stahl he'll take action if necessary. Here's a preview.
Well, there's a lot at stake. There's a lot at stake, and maybe especially so because this man was a reporter. There's something, you'll be surprised to hear me say that, there's something really terrible and disgusting about that if that were the case. So we're going to have to see. We're going to get to the bottom of it, and there will be severe punishment.
After President Trump's comments, the Saudi stock market experienced its biggest drop since 2014. It's the first indication investors are worried about possible economic sanctions against the kingdom. And in that same interview, the president told Stahl he might have another cabinet position to fill in the near future. Listen to this.
What about General Mattis? Is he going to leave?
Well, I don't know. He hasn't told me that. I have a very good relationship with him. I had lunch with him 2 days ago. I have a very good relationship with him. It could be that he is. I think he's sort of a Democrat, if you want to know the truth. But General Mattis is a good guy. We get along very well. He may leave. I mean, at some point, everybody leaves. Everybody. People leave. That's Washington.
That's Washington. You can see all of Leslie Stahl's interview with President Trump tonight on 60 Minutes on CBS. Well, meanwhile, Susan Page is USA Today's Washington bureau chief, and she joins me now to sort of weigh in on a number of topics. Susan, good to see you.
Hey, great to see you, DeMarco.
All right, Secretary Mattis has previously denied reports that he's leaving the Pentagon, but do the president's comments indicate otherwise?
Yeah, you know, if you're General Mattis and you weren't thinking about leaving, you probably are once you saw that interview, because the president certainly left that possibility open. That'd be distressing to a lot of policymakers around town here in Washington, because General Mattis has been seen as really a big voice of reason, a very skilled person handling matters there at the Pentagon. But the fact is, once this midterm election is over, we expect some big changes in the Trump administration. For instance, not just General Mattis, Jeff Sessions could be replaced as Attorney General. That will be a moment when we may see some big departures here.
I want to switch gears now if we can. American pastor Andrew Brunson was released Saturday after being detained in Turkey for nearly 2 years. President Trump praised the Turkish government. How will this impact relations with that country?
Well, we've had tough relations with Turkey for some time, in part because of the crackdown by the government there. There's a lot of anti-American feeling in Turkey. So this is helpful, I think. The fact this had been a thorn in the side of U.S.-Turkey relations, the long imprisonment of this pastor. So the fact that he's released, I think, is probably a good sign for U.S.-Turkish relations.
And, Susan, this comes as pressure sort of mounts on the president to take action regarding missing Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Turkey alleges the Saudi government killed the Washington Post columnist. However, Sunday, Riyadh reportedly rejected, quote, threats and political pressure about his disappearance. Can you talk about the diplomatic steps the president must decide on, and what are the ramifications that we are already seeing as he weighs in on his options?
And, you know, in the clip you just showed from 60 Minutes, you saw the president promising severe punishment if it turns out the Saudis assassinated this dissident journalist. And that is by far the toughest language he has used since this journalist disappeared under these very mysterious circumstances in Turkey. You know, there are a couple decisions the president needs to make. One is whether to go ahead with a huge amount of arms sales that have been negotiated between Washington and Saudi Arabia. There are some calls to call that off. He has indicated he's not inclined to do that. He says it would cost American jobs. But there's a very immediate question, and that is whether the U.S. Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin will go to a big Saudi-sponsored conference, an investors' conference. Some of the business leaders scheduled to go to that conference have now announced that they will not go in the wake of this controversy. And the question is, will the U.S. Treasury Secretary go there?
All right, Susan, let's go ahead and bring it back home. I want to ask you about some reporting that you did for USA Today. You say women were driving the midterms for Democrats, but now there's been a fundamental shift. Talk to us about what this, quote, backlash is and how could it boost the GOP in November?
You know, it's been interesting when we had kind of the first chapter of the additional hearings on Judge Kavanaugh to be confirmed as a justice of the Supreme Court after his accuser, Susan Blasey Ford, testified. Republicans were very nervous as this was going to be yet another damaging blow to their efforts to maintain their position in the midterm elections. But then when Judge Kavanaugh came back in with that kind of fierce response, and the president picked that up as saying he had been unfairly smeared, that really energized a lot of Republicans. You always see a kind of a closing of the polls, people coming home as you get close to Election Day. But this really accelerated that process, and it energized Republican voters in a way they hadn't been before.
Yeah,
we see this particularly in these Senate races in red states. We think Republicans are much more enthusiastic. They're going to hold the Senate in the wake of this latest development.
All right, so speaking of women, the aftermath of Kavanaugh's dramatic nomination hearings and narrow confirmation has spotlighted the gender divide of President Trump's tenure. Is this the Democrats' best bet to hit the president, or should they be focusing the narrative elsewhere ahead of November?
You know, it's interesting. When you talk to voters, you know what they talk to you about? They talk to you about health care. You know, whether you talk to voters in key districts or you do polling of them, healthcare is always at the top of their list. But the fact is, women voters and women candidates have been energized by opposition to President Trump. And that's been one of the remarkable developments of the past 2 years. It really comes to a head in 3 weeks when we see if the record number of women who have been nominated for the House, for the Senate, and for governors can actually win those elections.
All right, Democratic Senator Kamala Harris was a vocal critic during the Kavanaugh hearings. She announced this weekend she's visiting Iowa later this month, and we've seen a slew of potential 2020 candidates go to the Hawkeye state already. How do Senator Harris's prospects look for a presidential bid? I know everybody's talking about it. She has a chance. Does she or does she not?
Well, there are a lot of Democrats going to Iowa and New Hampshire. There is going to be no shortage of presidential candidates for Democrats in 2020, but every list includes Kamala Harris, who is from a big, important state from California. She is seen as having been pretty effective in the questioning she did there in the Senate Judiciary Committee. She is definitely on the list, but there are a lot of names on that list, starting with Joe Biden and going through a half a dozen of her associates there in the U.S. Senate.
All right, Susan Page, always good to see you. Susan, thank you.
Thank you.